Hello, welcome back to the YouTube channel of Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley. I'm Pastor Gervais Charney, and this is another Shropshire church. This is the Priory Church of St Gregory the Great, Morville. It was built in 1118 as the centrepiece of a Benedictine priory here, dependent on Shrewsbury Abbey. You may know Shrewsbury Abbey from the Cadfael novels. The priory would have been much smaller. It would still have had many of the same features as, of course, the abbey. It would have had a dormitory for the monks. It would have had a refectory where they ate. There would have been a little cloister. Nothing survives today except the church. The rest was swept away at the dissolution of the monasteries in 1545. And some of the stone of the old abbey, of the old priory buildings rather, was used to build a new manor house, which has been altered and changed over the years, but still survives as Morville Hall, belongs to the National Trust, is not normally open, unfortunately. But the parish church survives. It's one of these cases where the priory church was also the parish church, and so the villagers needed somewhere to worship. And this is where priory and abbey churches survive, is where they are in part or in whole used by the ordinary people. This is, as I say, originally a Norman building. It's quite grand. The monks here owned the church at Aston-Ayre, which, God willing, is the last video in this series, the previous video in the series, and so this will be going up after that one. The church has, of course, been altered in the 14th, 15th centuries. Of course, there's a massive Victorian restoration. It was quite necessary at the time. So as we look around, we'll see some of the important features of this interesting Norman priory church. As usual, we start at the west end. As I said, this is a priory church. It's built by the Benedictines. They are effectively your bog standard Western monks, and they are the people that all the other Western monks basically split off from, regarding them as having become corrupt over time, and then of course there's splits from the splits and so on. We have a font, which is a lovely carved Norman tub. It's quite a high status tub. Obviously the monks are showing off their wealth and importance by having this beautifully carved. It's largely geometric and floral patterns. It hasn't got figures on it, but there's one or two little faces. There's one there you can see. There we are, just centered on the little face. But again, it all goes in with that. We have here early 19th or maybe even 18th century 10 Commandment boards, and all churches were supposed to display them. We have here these medieval carved heads over what's now the vestry of the tower door. The tower's now the vestry, and so of course it's locked. The old parish chest is this great lump of wood that's just been dug out. So it's a solid trunk that's been roughly. I'm all right, don't worry. It's a solid trunk that's been carefully dug out, rather crudely shaped. Lovely, lovely piece, obviously fixed down. And anyway, if you try and lift that, you get a hernia. A roll of honour here for the Great War. And this is everyone who served. It's not just those who died. You can see here a little bit of medieval wall painting has been exposed. And there'll be a lot more under the whitewash. One of the problems with exposing wall painting is it tends to fade. Now, even before the Norman church, there was a church here. It was a Saxon Minster. And around 1086, it becomes then the priory, and it's rebuilt in 1118. So this is a church. There's probably been a church here since. Well, there's definitely a church before Norman Conquest. Maybe 1,000 years there's been a church here, which is quite amazing, really. A lovely Norman chancel arch, quite big, of course. But you can see the form here is a little bit more elaborate. You've got a nice arcade. You've got these wonderful clustered columns, which is all part of in some sense showing off, but also a demonstration of the status of the building. You've got memorials here. There's a window that is dedicated, 1940s, this one, 1946, and it's got pictures of St. Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine of Canterbury, of course, is the chap who re-evangelizes southern England. And there's Gregory the Great. He is the Bishop of Rome who sends Augustine out on the mission, of course, for whom also Gregorian chant is named, although modern Gregorian chant isn't really Gregorian, it's a development since Gregory. Pulpit is a great lump of medieval stone, of Victorian stone, not a bad one actually. It's not as lumpen as some. It's got this rather nice tracery cut in it, which is something that a medieval stone pulpit would have had, and the stone fits with the status of the building here. We have here the eagle lectern, there's the pulpit, and there's the chancel. The organ is by George Holditch. George Holditch is one of the great organ builders of the 19th century. You can just see their defaced Norman capital with a little man on it. Captain William Henry Joseph Barber Starkey of the 52nd Battery Royal Field Artillery died September the 10th, 1914 in German Field Hospital from wounds received at the Battle of Le Cateau on August 26th, aged 34. Once again, it's this point that every attack needs its junior officers, and every attack risks the junior officers dying. And a lot of big house families are affected here. We have here the Reverend William Heaton, M.A., vicar of this parish, 1894 to 1899, died 1899, aged 64. It's quite common, actually, to have older and more infirm clergy sent to nice rural parishes like this, with a nice big rectory and a nice big vicarage here, and a nice big house next door. Not a lot of work to do, because there was no retirement in those days. It wasn't great for the parishes, but again, there was no retirement in those days. Retirement is actually a very helpful thing here. These nice three-bay Norman arcades, they're very fancy actually for the period, they're very, very fancy. Good. These are funerary hatchments. They'd be displayed at the funeral, and you can see we've got these symbolism, the skull, the winged skull, and the crossed bones. Nothing to do with pirates, of course, it's to do with time and death. Another Gregory the Great, but also then St. Matthew the Evangelist. It's a lovely, lovely organ. I mean, look at that. It's a nice organ case. The organ itself has it dates from 1855. 1855 is by G.M. Holditch. Very significant. And it's still almost in its original condition. Nice standard candelabra here. Minton tiles. Minton gave a lot of essentially end-of-line tiles free to churches doing restorations. And what this means is that these tiles, essentially you're doing a big job. One of the most notable ones is to do actually tiles that are made for the United States Capitol. It's not here, but the end of line, you do a big job, you make more than the job actually needs in case there's a problem, and you go, well, what do we do with the leftovers? Well, if you're a devout Victorian, you give them to parish churches doing restorations. You have here the east window, which is Christ the Workman. Very unusual. You don't often see Christ the Workman in a stained glass window. So there he is in a crucifixion-style attitude, and it's Christ the Carpenter. You've got on the one hand Mary looking at the gifts that the Magi left, on the other hand Joseph labouring away, and then in the middle Christ at the workbench. We've got, again, unusually there's a Union flag in the church. Here is one of the great treasures. Of course, the medieval monastic church would have had loads of stained glass, but here's a last fragment, really, a medieval crucifixion. It's a very handsome building, rural Shropshire, little known because of its location. It's not very far from Bridgnorth, but it's not well signed, actually. You do have to know it's here. Which obviously I didn't make sure I knew it was here before coming. Here we have these later medieval windows, and there's probably an old communion table there. It's interesting, something we've seen happening recently in churches is pictures of the King and the late Queen. I don't remember there being many pictures of the Queen in Anglican churches during her lifetime. But, of course, with the death of the Queen, much lamented, and the accession of Charles, we now have pictures of both of them in many, many churches. This is a memorial window for the dead of the First World War, and it memorial both of the dead of this parish, which includes Aston Ayr. And be ye faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. And we've got here memorials. We've got the names of the men: Captain Barbara Starkey, Second Lieutenant Harper, Private Fouke, Private Haycox, Private Robbins, 2 officers, and 3 privates. There's going back to the pulpit. It's a marvellous building. We've got these it's hard to see them, and this camera is not going to work to try and zoom in on them, but there are figures of the evangelists, carved figures of the evangelists, either side of the nave. And so, there's a nice Norman window there, so you can tell these aisles are Norman, even though most of the windows have been replaced. And back then to this rather lovely tub font. There's a tub, of course, because the Normans would immerse infants. In fact, that's the normal means of baptism in England until into the 17th century. It's normal for infants to be immersed in the font. That's why the fonts are so big. And then in the 17th century, it falls out of favour, and it becomes now we sprinkle the infant instead. But medieval English baptisms were immersion of infants. Just a point. And so here we are outside at Morville Priory Church. The Priory buildings would probably have been on this side of the church. I say that because there's a stream behind the camera, and one thing that all medieval monasteries needed was a stream. You needed a water supply, and the water supply is usually run in some way. There's a runoff done from it to flush out the toilets, basically. What's often referred to as the reredoter, or the latrine, because you've got monks, they have bodily needs and bodily needs. There's no sign of the monastic buildings here. They've been demolished. The stone has been reused elsewhere, but the church is still here. It also explains probably why you've got Norman windows on this side and not the other side. But because then the monastic building was swept away, you've then had this south side entrance, the south side, the normal side of your front door for churches. So we'll have a look around the outside, point out some features some to do with the monastery and some to do with later alterations. So around the outside we've got this lovely Norman tower, at least the lower part is Norman, the upper part appears to be a later addition. Very, very common, of course. When the clerestory is added, you've then got to raise the tower, so the tower still towers. The south door, what's known as the priest's door in the chancel, that has been rebuilt, and there's the date above it, 1683. But as we go up to it, you'll see that there's still Norman material, and we can see here why it was rebuilt. And very important, Norman priests were small and skinny, and that's a Norman tympanum. And that tympanum tells us that that is about as wide as the door was. And you can imagine a better fed Restoration era vicar would have trouble squeezing through a door that skinny, and so what they've done is they've altered it. The tympanum has been retained, but the door has been widened because it had to be, because you need to get the vicar through the vicar's door. There's no point having a vicar's door he can't get through. Pan around here, you've got a substantial graveyard. Most of the graves here are quite recent, though, in this part, which again suggests, well, there's the medieval cross, but of course the monks would have had their own burial. You can see that line of trees there beyond the hedge, that's the stream, and that would be very, very important. That's why I suspect that the medieval buildings are on this side. House on the hill. Now we are, look back, and lovely building. Obviously the modern roof line is that clear street's been added probably in the 15th century. The windows have been renewed in the 19th, and they've said, oh, we wanted to look a little bit more pointy and less perpendicular. There's this prejudice against the perpendicular, which is quite wrong. We have here the Reverend Horatio J. Ward, M.A. of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, who was for 19 years a vicar of Morville and Aston Ayr. Because Emmanuel College is established as a Puritan college, but loses that identity as with the Restoration and the ejection of the Puritans. Well, there's the hall. Now, the hall today is this rather blocky, Georgian-looking building. It is older, but it's had an extra story added, and that's very much altered its appearance. Big house and church very near each other, and obviously the stone that's used to build the big house comes from the Priory. And here we are round now the north side, and this is relatively plain. That's the organ chamber, of course, sticking out from the chancel. Victorian edition, when they got the organ. There is a lich gate, and who has the quickest walk to church in the morning? Well, it's the big house family. They are, after all, the ones who are giving the most money. It's a very plain site here, but there's no evidence, again, of having had monastic buildings joined to it. It may have been that the Priory wasn't attached to the church at all, but would have stood a little bit further away. This happens. See these nice 15th century windows there in the chancel. So that's Morville Priory, St Gregory's. So there you have it, Morville Priory, St Gregory's. Behind me, of course, is the Victorian lich gate. A priory, just to, I suppose I ought to mention this, a priory in this context is a dependent monastery on an abbey. So Shrewsbury Abbey, Morville Priory. Shrewsbury Abbey would have an abbot at the head and a deputy called the prior. But here, because it's only a priory, the abbot at Shrewsbury is at the head, and the prior locally is the top man in this house. He's answerable to the abbot there at Shrewsbury. He would have a sub-prior under him, and obviously there is a hierarchy in these places. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you until next time.